It was a gentle June afternoon in St. Ludlow's, the kind that seemed to promise nothing more than wholesome idleness and soft laughter drifting across clipped hedges. Mrs. Armitage, the vicar's wife, had opened her garden to the village for her annual charity tea. White linen fluttered from borrowed tables. Scents of chamomile and peonies mingled in the air, while the laughter of children and the subdued commotion of grown-ups completed the scene of rural tranquility. Miss Jane Marple, a fixture of every local gathering, settled herself in a quiet corner beneath the ancient copper beech, discreetly observing as generations mixed and mingled. Her eyes, a cool and kindly grey, wandered past the cake-laden tables, lingering on Mr. Osborne, the recently arrived solicitor, already at ease among the matrons, and on Mrs. Cummings, whose curt smile seldom hid the fact that she loathed parties, yet never missed one. The event unfolded as expected until a shrill cry shattered the harmony. Guests froze, teacups paused mid-air. Young Lily Dawes, bonnet askew, ran from the shrubbery near the croquet lawn, her hands trembling, and a strange, glittering object cradled in her palm. "There's someone in the rose beds," she gasped, voice tinged with real terror. "She's not moving." Time folded in on itself. Miss Marple watched as the crowd surged, drawn more by curiosity than dread, she noted. She rose quietly, her step measured, trailing the eager throng to the crimson blooms. Beneath a drift of petals lay the still form of Mrs. Vivian Caxton, formerly of good standing, now the subject of hushed rumor since her husband's untimely death. Her dress was neat, her complexion blanched, and around her neck shimmered a peculiar, enamelled pendant, a piece unknown to Miss Marple, yet oddly out of place among St. Ludlow's usual fashion. As the villagers gathered, exchanging furtive glances and whispered suspicions, Miss Marple's gaze lingered not upon the drama, but upon the subtle play of emotion in the crowd. Mrs. Cummings's pursed lips, Mr. Osborne's oddly fixed stare, and the tremor in Lily's hand. Much would be said before the night fell, but as Miss Marple well knew, rarely the truth. In the hush that followed, the sound of hurried footsteps announced the arrival of Inspector Graves. As he barked questions, Miss Marple returned quietly to her seat, her mind already threading together the day's small peculiarities and long-standing grievances, beginning, always, with the question no one else bothered to ask. Who, indeed, might have taken such pains to wear an unfamiliar pendant to a village garden party? And why? It was the general consensus that nothing truly dreadful could happen in St. Ludlow's without the news traveling faster than a midsummer thunderclap. By the time Mrs. Armitage's garden had begun to empty, and the inspector had established a perimeter of sorts, 2 constables pacing solemnly at the gate, half the village had already heard of Mrs. Vivian Caxton's abrupt and tragic end. The following morning dawned pale and damp, the sunlight diffused behind a thin veil of mist. Along the high street, the grocer's door had barely opened when the first whispers began to circulate in earnest. Mrs. Penfold, a spry woman of 70 with an unashamed love of gossip, spoke in a hushed yet urgent tone to anyone willing to linger over the potato sacks. By mid-morning, the matter had migrated to the tea-room adjoining Mrs. Wickham's general store, a modest space heavy with the scent of baking scones and chatter. Miss Marple had not intended to visit just yet. Experience had taught her that the freshest gossip often carried the ring of truth, however accidentally, and she took her place unobtrusively at a corner table, a pot of Earl Grey and a single cherry bun before her. She greeted acquaintances with that same mild smile which gave little away, all the while noting the pronounced energy in the room. Mrs. Cummings sat with her knitting bag propped beside her, the long click of her needles punctuating sharp comments. Opposite her, Mr. Osborne leaned in a fraction too close, his voice low and measured. They shared an intensity of exchange unusual for mere neighbors. At the adjoining table, young Lily Dawes sipped her tea as though it were an obligation. her eyes on the street outside and her fingers restless upon the handle of her cup. A trembling hand yesterday, restless fingers today. It was, Miss Marple thought, a progression of interest. Mrs. Penfold, meanwhile, provided the unofficial account of events for the benefit of Mrs. Carter, who, owing to a long-standing dislike of large gatherings, had not attended the garden party at all. "They say she was lying neat as you please, just there in the rose bed," Mrs. Penfold insisted, lowering her voice more out of drama than discretion. "Not a scratch on her, and the pendant, Lord, that pendant! A great gaudy thing you'd expect on the stage, not hanging from the neck of a lady like Mrs. Caxton. If she was still a lady, mind. There was talk about her and that cousin's inheritance, you'll recall. It isn't the sort of jewelry she'd ever been seen wearing," Mrs. Carter remarked, adjusting her spectacles. "I don't remember her having it after her husband passed either. It must have been recent." The insertion of that single word, recent, lodged itself quietly in Miss Marple's mind. How easily time compressed in idle recollections, and how a vague recent could cover anything from hours to years, depending on the speaker's inclination. Inspector Graves entered then, a man of solid build and no-nonsense manner. His presence drew a hush over the chatter, much like a sudden draught extinguishing a candle's flame. "Morning," he said briskly, removing his bowler and scanning the assembled faces. "I'll thank you for not spreading wild theories. We have reason to believe Mrs. Caxton's passing was not due to natural causes. Until the coroner's report is official, I'll be speaking to those who were nearest to the rose garden yesterday." Mrs. Cummings straightened, smoothing her skirt with both palms. "I should think that means Lily here," she remarked, with a pointed glance at the youth. "She's the one who found her." Poor Lily flushed at once, twisting her teaspoon in the saucer till it clattered. I saw something shining and went to look." "I didn't know." "No one's blaming you, child," Inspector Graves interjected, though in a tone calculated to quiet her rather than comfort. His eyes lingered on her face, searching before turning to sweep the room again. "Mr. Osborne, if I might have a word outside." The solicitor rose with a polite nod, casting a fleeting glance towards Mrs. Cummings as he passed. She did not meet his eyes, instead busying herself with her knitting once more, though at a pace quicker now, the needles clicking with just a trace of agitation. Miss Marple took another measured sip of tea, her gaze gentle, almost abstracted to the casual observer. Yet she noted every gesture, every inflection, every minuscule pause. In particular, she catalogued Mrs. Cummings's sudden industriousness with her knitting, Lily's reluctance to look anywhere near the inspector, and Mrs. Penfold's habit of embellishing certain truths while quietly omitting others. When at last Inspector Graves and Mr. Osborne returned, their discussion appeared concluded but not settled. The inspector made his exit with a curt nod, leaving the solicitor frowning faintly into the middle distance before resuming his seat. It was Mrs. Wickham who ventured the next remark, emerging from behind her counter with a plate of warm scones. "Can't imagine why anyone would wish Mrs. Caxton harm. A touch superior, perhaps, but always paid her bills in full and on time. She'd been quiet since her husband died, mostly keeping to herself. Couldn't have crossed too many people's paths." "That," Miss Marple said mildly, "rather depends on where one walks." Her voice, so quiet, might have been mistaken for a passing thought aimed at no one in particular, but she caught the subtle shift in Mr. Osborne's posture, just enough to suggest that the words had grazed some private nerve. The conversation in the tea-room gradually returned to safer topics, or at least to less fatal ones. The upcoming summer fete, Mrs. Penfold's complaints about the post, a brief debate about whether the vicar's sermon had been too direct the previous Sunday. Miss Marple finished her cherry bun without haste, then rose, offering polite nods to those who acknowledged her. Outside, the mist had begun to lift, revealing the neat rows of shop fronts and the slow stream of village life unaffected, at least on the surface, by the drama of the previous day. She paused briefly by the florist's window, her reflection faint against the display of daisies and carnations. An enamelled pendant, quite new among old associations. A solicitor with an odd tension in his jaw. A young girl both frightened and restless. A neighbour who busied her hands when others might express sympathy. It was all far too untidy for Miss Marple's liking. She walked on, her knitting bag resting lightly on her arm, her mind occupied not with theories, those were premature, but with questions that had the peculiar habit of unearthing their own answers if given time and the right company. And somewhere beneath all the polite words and cautious glances, Miss Marple sensed the first faint stirrings of fear. Not the fear of yesterday's discovery, but something older, more personal, and infinitely more dangerous. The village, she thought, was about to make itself very interesting indeed. The day after the tea-room's morning congress dawned even brighter, as if St. Ludlow's, determined to assert its usual gentility, decided that nature itself should offer reassurance. The air was crisp and sweet, the village lanes washed in a soft gold that settled calmly upon stone cottages and clipped private hedges. But beneath the familiar routines, something taut and invisible had begun to stretch through the populace, a nervousness just out of sight, perceptible only to those who knew which faces to watch and which silences to listen for. Miss Marple, having taken breakfast in her neat sunlit parlour, set out with her knitting in progress tucked discreetly in her bag. She appeared to anyone passing as a harmless old lady with time to spare on a friendly stroll, yet her eyes moved ceaselessly across gardens, gates and porches, gathering details with the kind of sharpness that left most people entirely unaware of scrutiny. Today, she meant not only to take the air, but to place herself at certain points where gossip pooled and tempers flickered. Always, she knew, the most fertile ground at times of crisis. Her first stop was the vicarage garden, where Mrs. Armitage, stoic as ever, supervised two reluctant young churchwardens in their efforts to tidy away the remnants of the ill-fated party. Petals were caught in the grass, and the patch beneath the copper beech bore the faint impression of so many shoes. Miss Marple greeted Mrs. Armitage warmly, admiring the resilience that saw her hosting a garden tea so soon after tragedy. "My dear Jane," said the vicar's wife, voice subdued but steady, "I do believe I shall forgo next year's fete altogether. Too much excitement, and the constables made an awful mess of the rose beds." She sighed. "It's such a shame about Mrs. Caxton. I never would have anticipated such an end. One expects misfortune in the world, of course, but not in one's own garden." Miss Marple nodded. "Grief always seems larger when placed among lilies and biscuits, I find," she replied quietly. "You hadn't noticed anything unusual, I suppose, among the guests or in Mrs. Caxton's behaviour?" Mrs. Armitage considered, fingers working at the cuffs of a gardening apron. She kept a little apart, more withdrawn than last year. "I did hear her mention to Mrs. Cummings that she'd acquired something special on her recent trip to Bath, but I wasn't close enough to hear what it was. Perhaps the pendant." Miss Marple tucked away that detail, as she did all hints of personal connection. Did Mrs. Caxton seem troubled? Or angry, perhaps? She was always particular, not cold, but careful. There was some business with her late husband's family, I believe. A cousin contesting the will at one point. Nothing came of it, but I gathered she'd felt alone. We all assumed she'd settled her affairs. Mrs. Armitage's expression soured with genuine regret. If this was robbery, well, that's even more dreadful. But the inspector's asking so many questions about yesterday's arguments. Miss Marple, her face sympathetic, drew Mrs. Armitage gently into conversation, sifting for anything new. But it soon became clear that the hostess's observations, while honest, were clouded by the ordinary distractions of hospitality. Thanking her, Miss Marple moved on through the village. She was not above stopping to chat with Mrs. Wickham outside the general store, nor lingering in conversation with Dr. Larch as he made his house calls. But it was in the post office, where morning correspondence was being sorted, that she encountered a small but significant drama. Mrs. Cummings stood at the counter, her voice strained and her manner unusually brusque. "But I told you," she exclaimed, her eyes tight, "I received no letter from Mrs. Caxton this month. I've been expecting her annual notes ever since Herbert passed, and she never missed a date before. Are you quite certain nothing came?" Postmistress Letty, never known for subtlety, was quick to assure her. "You had no envelope marked from Bath, if that's what you're asking, though there was something in from London. Are you certain she didn't deliver it in person at the party?" Mrs. Cummings shook her head, for the briefest instant, her composure failing. "Vivian and I were barely on speaking terms. The pendant she wore, I didn't recognize it. I'd wonder if she wasn't acting strangely, showing it off as though it meant something." Miss Marple, having entered quietly, offered a gentle greeting. "Bad news has a way of arriving in awkward packages, dear. But perhaps whatever was left unsaid may now come to light." Mrs. Cummings glanced at her, defensive. "You always do know what's happening beneath the surface, Jane." "I only know what people show me, one way or another," Miss Marple replied gently, but the words lingered uneasily. She left the post office and ambled in the direction of the green, where Mr. Osborne could be found most mornings, walking with the air of a man weighing matters of gravity far greater than bird song or village disputes. Approaching him, Miss Marple offered a mild remark about the roses in bloom. "Ah, yes," he replied, voice distant. "An unfortunate coincidence, all things considered. Poor Mrs. Caxton. She had legal troubles that were never entirely resolved. Her husband's estate? Such cases are never clean, you know. I'm afraid the pendant may have been more than a mere ornament. Family heirloom, perhaps." Miss Marple's interest piqued, but not one recognized by the family, surely. Mrs. Armitage thought it new. He hesitated, choosing his words. "Old things can come into new hands unexpectedly, Miss Marple. There was talk of a missing piece among the Caxton belongings years ago. The pendant may be it if Mrs. Caxton finally recovered it. Of course, such relics often stir old wounds, resentments, even fear." She let the silence settle between them before diverting the conversation to safer ground, thanking him for his thoughts. She spent the remainder of the morning weaving her way through the ordinary spaces, where, after a tragedy, village life is both most fragile and most revealing. At midday, she arrived at the home of Lily Dawes, determined to offer comfort and to gently pry beneath the surface of the girl's anxiety. Lily's mother, flushed with embarrassment at Miss Marple's unexpected visit, ushered her into a tidy sitting room where Lily sat with a schoolbook open but untouched. "I only saw the pendant first," Lily blurted once her mother left to brew tea. "It was lying across Mrs. Caxton's neck, and the sunlight hit it. I went to see if she was awake, maybe if she'd dropped it." Her voice faltered. "I wish I hadn't." Miss Marple's tone was soft as she asked, "You're sure you didn't see anyone else in the rose beds before you found her?" "Number just steps in the path." "I wasn't paying attention. I'd wanted to be left alone. There was arguing earlier, near the croquet lawn. Mrs. Cummings and Mrs. Caxton, maybe, but I didn't hear what was said." Miss Marple regarded Lily gently. "Did you ever see Mrs. Caxton wear that pendant before, or speak of it?" Lily shook her head. "She said it was for protection, joked about keeping secrets safe, something like that. She wasn't laughing." Miss Marple considered the layers of meaning a nervous young person might apply to such remarks. She left Lily reassured, but with another detail. A pendant for protection, new yet old, drawing attention and anxiety among those who knew its history. Later, as the afternoon stretched towards evening, Miss Marple settled into her usual table in the tea-room, notebook discreetly at hand. She reviewed the facts gathered so far, a unique pendant rumored lost and now returned, old family grievances, Mrs. Cummings's agitation, Mr. Osborne's guarded speech, and Lily's fragmentary memories. She saw in these fleeting exchanges the long shadow of human entanglement, a secret here, a quarrel there, fraying the careful surface of village life. There remained inconsistencies too delicate to confront directly, yet the same subtleties that had solved other puzzles in the past. Miss Marple needed to watch, to listen through layers of emotion and habit, and to wait for the moment when truth, cloaked in gossip or overlooked in ordinary speech, would declare itself. As dusk fell, she attended a hastily convened meeting at the church hall where Inspector Graves addressed the villagers. He outlined what little was yet known. No sign of forced entry, no obvious theft, and a cause of death not immediately apparent. The pendant was mentioned only as an item of interest, its significance yet unproven, its provenance questioned but not confirmed. Questions and speculation abounded among the crowd. Arguments over motive and disputes about Mrs. Caxton's character revived memories of old quarrels and bitter legacies. Miss Marple sat quietly, almost invisible, observing patterns of behavior, the way Mrs. Cummings avoided Mr. Osborne's glance, the stiffness in Lily's posture, and the guilty murmurs exchanged between a pair of villagers with more curiosity than grief. And so, as night drew in, Miss Marple returned home, her mind full of impressions and careful deductions, certain that beneath the ordinary surface of St. Ludlow's, hidden tensions had at last come dangerously close to the light. She added a few lines to her notebook, each question suspended for the time being. Who had reason to resent Mrs. Caxton or benefit from her death? Why appear with the pendant only now, and to whom did it truly belong? And above all, what vital detail had slipped through the cracks, overlooked by the hurried investigators but present, if only one paid sufficient attention to the minutiae of mood and manner? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked gently in the quiet of her parlor, echoing the relentless workings of her mind. Tomorrow, she resolved, she would look further into the stories behind the pendant and the tangled relationships it had set ablaze. For in the village of St. Ludlow's, every secret had a shadow, and Miss Marple was one who never lost sight of the difference between what was spoken and what was withheld. By midweek, the gentle order of St. Ludlow's had given way to a tentative unease. The days still shone warm, washing the lanes and gardens in a honeyed light, but conversation everywhere was strained. Every doorstep, every quiet lane seemed tender with expectation, as though the village itself sensed that nothing had truly settled since the shock of Mrs. Caxton's death. If there was comfort to be found, it came only in routine. On Wednesday mornings, the library opened early. Mrs. Turner, the librarian, swept in anticipation of the half-dozen villagers who made a practice of borrowing novels they'd already read. Miss Marple, always a proponent of well-kept habits, arrived precisely on time. She exchanged pleasantries with Mrs. Turner, borrowed an unremarkable detective story, and let herself be overtaken by the hush that enveloped the orderly rows of books. It was a perfect setting for reflection, and Miss Marple allowed her mind to linger not on fiction, but on the facts as she'd gathered them. Outside, the investigation moved forward with determined energy. Inspector Graves had taken up a cautious campaign, dividing the principal suspects from the merely curious. Miss Marple noted that his approach favored the obvious, the connections closest to Mrs. Caxton, the quarrels most easily remembered, and the motives nearly ripe for picking. Mrs. Cummings found herself at the forefront, her tense manner and sharp tongue having drawn the eye of authority. Mr. Osborne, too, attracted scrutiny. His role as solicitor placed him at the heart of both the Caxton family's affairs and their disputes. The morning brought news fresh enough to make its way around the village before noon. The inspector had called Mrs. Cummings to the station for a formal interview. Rumors bloomed with new life at the baker's, in the greengrocer's queue, and among the benches at the churchyard. Some recalled an old episode, a public argument, a break in correspondence. Others whispered about the inheritance and the unresolved bitterness about the division of property. Few spoke kindly, as if recent tragedy had diminished patience for the usual courtesies. Miss Marple observed all of this from her unremarkable vantage. A careful stroll under the hawthorn trees, a word with Mr. Williams at the cobbler's, and a question to Mrs. Bradley about milk deliveries. She did not press or prod. Instead, she listened, gently prompting recollection and testing the edges of memory. At midday, the village green became a theatre for a new drama. Mrs. Cummings, eyes darting from shade to sunlight, returned from her meeting with Inspector Graves. Her movements were brisk, almost defiant, but her posture betrayed exhaustion. She paused outside the butcher's, fumbling with her purse, and it was young Lily Dawes who hesitated by her side, laden with packages and uncertainty. "I'm sorry about before," Lily offered, voice trembling. "They keep asking if I saw anything, but I didn't really. Only the pendant. Have you ever seen it before?" Mrs. Cummings's lips thinned. "No, never." It wasn't hers. It wasn't anyone's, as far as I know. Vivian kept her business private. She gave Lily a strange, weary smile. "It's a hard thing, child, to lose a neighbor, especially if you never quite made peace." Miss Marple, seated on a bench with her knitting and the appearance of supreme contentment, watched the exchange. She let Lily pass, greeting her warmly, then gently inquired if Mrs. Cummings was feeling well. "Hardly," was the reply, softer now. "They suspect, well, they always do, don't they? Because of that argument last year, Vivian and I disagreed about how much was owed for the church roof. Ridiculous, isn't it? To think such petty things could lead to—" She trailed off. "Now there's talk of poison, too. The inspector says nothing is proven." Miss Marple considered the weight behind those words. Poison, suggestion, accusation. "Sometimes," she observed gently, "the smallest quarrels mask the largest wounds. People remember what hurts them most and seldom what's forgiven." Mrs. Cummings seemed to ponder this, but her reluctance to engage was clear. The village, she knew, had selected its first suspect, and she had become the center of storms she'd once only glimpsed from the margins. Elsewhere, Mr. Osborne spent the afternoon sorting paperwork in his dark-paneled office. His movements were precise, his manner composed, but the air of distraction around him grew more noticeable as the inquiry continued. Miss Marple found an occasion to visit him on the pretense of seeking advice about her own affairs, and they spoke quietly about the burdens of responsibility. "I'm afraid much depends on documentation," Mr. Osborne explained, his hands arranging sheets of legal correspondence. Mrs. Caxton was methodical, almost obsessive about things others neglect. "I handled her late husband's estate and the subsequent inheritance, of course. There were claims, always claims. Relatives appear when money disappears." Miss Marple mused. "No doubt people believe her death resolves their anxieties. A legacy, especially one involving secrets, can fester long after the signature dries." He gave her an inscrutable look. "I can only hope justice isn't rushed. When tempers are high, mistakes are easily made." She thanked him, carefully storing away the tension that lingered in his voice. A note of fear or guilt she could not yet distinguish. That evening, the inspector paid a visit to Dr. Larch, who had been the first called to the garden party's scene. Their voices, though confidential, drifted to Miss Marple, where she sat in the drawing-room with Mrs. Wickham. "It's not the cause of death that troubles me most," Dr. Larch was saying within earshot, "but the timing. No sign of heart trouble, nothing in the post-mortem yet to suggest an obvious poison. I'd wager we're dealing with something old-fashioned, perhaps a slow agent. The pendant is a clue, certainly strange, but if there's more, well, it's not for me to say." Inspector Graves's reply was curt. Something must have pushed Mrs. Caxton to bring it out now. Someone wanted that pendant, for what it meant or what it hides. Miss Marple allowed the conversation to settle. Motive was thick in the air, but the pendant's significance, whether monetary, sentimental, or symbolic, remained elusive. Had Mrs. Caxton feared for herself or for what the pendant represented? And who else might have wanted it enough to cross the line from quarrel to crime? As dusk arrived, the villagers again gathered around firesides and supper tables, the tone of talk growing sharper. A few began to whisper of Mrs. Caxton's cousin, Gregory Ashby, absent from St. Ludlow's but frequently invoked in tales of long-standing disputes. Another rumour swelled that Mrs. Caxton had confided in the vicar, leaving a written account to be read in the event of her death. None of these whispers satisfied Miss Marple. Each was too quick, too simple. She turned her thoughts to the pendant, its enamelled surface and intricate pattern. Where did it truly come from? What did it conceal or reveal about its owner? She took care to remember small contradictions. Miss Cummings's certainty, Mr. Osborne's caution, and Lily's nervous honesty. And she wondered if the key to the crime lay not in the violent act, but in the years preceding it. Old injuries, forgotten promises, and the slow, unmarked accumulation of resentment. Before sleep, Miss Marple added to her notebook. Why was Mrs. Caxton so intent on displaying the pendant after years of secrecy? Was Mrs. Cummings's anger what drove the village against her, or something deeper? What role had Mr. Osborne really played in the family's affairs? Could Lily's innocence hide a different kind of truth, one seldom trusted in grown-up disputes? Miss Marple set her spectacles aside and gazed out into the darkening street, the hush broken only by distant dog barks and the creak of garden gates. The mystery grew, its contours still uncertain. But Miss Marple knew, as she always did, that human nature rarely concealed itself perfectly for long. Shadows lengthen, secrets strain to be heard, and the smallest clue, if seen truly, could unravel the entire fabric of deceit. Tomorrow, she would seek the hidden clue no one else had noticed, far from the confusion of finger-pointing and suspicion, and draw the threads a little tighter for all to see. The morning after the village's latest flurry of suspicion was one of deceptive serenity. The air carried the warmth of late summer, and from her front window Miss Marple could see Mrs. Fletcher pegging out laundry in tidy rows, while Mr. Harding paused to comment on the weather to anyone who would listen. It all appeared as ordinary as any English morning could be, but Miss Marple knew such calm was often the very skin over unsettled waters. She had decided today would be a day for quiet watching, not questioning. People, she had learned, often revealed far more when they thought no one was looking or listening too hard. Her plan was simple. Attend to a few errands, place herself near certain conversations, and keep her mind open to any small stray detail that might slip by others. St. Ludlow's Church, with its ancient square tower and worn flagstones, was a hub of unobtrusive movement in the mornings. Miss Marple timed her own arrival to coincide with the cleaning rota, knowing that Mrs. Armitage would be overseeing the volunteers, dusting pews and arranging hymnals. Inside, she found the vicar's wife at her most efficient, marshalling her helpers while bestowing kind smiles on those who lingered. It was while passing along the north aisle that Miss Marple noticed something curiously out of place. A single crushed white rose tucked into a hymnal, the petals bruised as if handled roughly. It was a variety she recognized, the same delicate bloom Mrs. Armitage grew by her rose beds, where Mrs. Caxton had been found. She lifted it lightly between her fingers. Mrs. Armitage, glancing over, said, "Oh, I imagine someone left it there after the service, possibly part of the arrangements from Sunday." Miss Marple only smiled, replacing it gently. So often flowers tell their own little tales. She remarked and moved on. But inwardly, she mocked it. A flower from the very spot of the tragedy, concealed among hymn pages? Curious. Not proof, but another stitch in the tapestry forming in her mind. Her next stop was the market square. She paused in Mrs. Wickham's shop, where two women were speaking in hushed voices beside the bolts of calico. Miss Marple appeared wholly occupied in selecting a small skein of wool, but her ears, quite without her permission, caught their words. And he said he saw her at the post office the day before, with a package. Wrapped brown paper, tied neatly, in the shape of it, like a little box. Said she posted it to herself, if you can believe such a thing. "Why would anyone do that?" came the whispered reply. "That's just it. Unless she wanted something kept safe until after. Well," the second voice trailed away. Miss Marple kept her head bowed, winding wool between her fingers. A self-addressed package before one's death was worth remembering? Where it might be now was a question she could not yet pursue directly, but she made a quiet, mental note to check with the postmistress in the coming days. Later that afternoon, she passed by the vicarage once more and found the vicar in his study, a mild, scholarly man leafing through papers. In his hesitant manner, he revealed a peculiar tidbit. "Mrs. Caxton did leave me a sealed envelope," he admitted, almost apologetically. "She told me to hold it until the end of the month unless something unexpected happened to her. I handed it over to the inspector this morning. I haven't read it, of course." Miss Marple's expression betrayed nothing beyond a courteous interest. "It is remarkable," she said gently, "how forethought can sometimes be mistaken for premonition." She walked away weighing this new morsel of truth. A sealed envelope, a posted package, and a pendant shown publicly for the first time in years, all so near her death. The pattern began to show itself in faint lines, though the full picture was not yet visible. By tea-time, the air was humming with the latest development. Inspector Graves had summoned Mr. Osborne again for questioning. This time, however, the solicitor emerged with an air not of worry, but of irritation, as though his professional integrity had been tested one time too many times. Miss Marple, seated at her customary table in the tea-room, caught the slight way he pushed his teacup aside untouched, lost in thought. Lily Dawes entered moments later, a reluctant figure in the doorway, clasping something wrapped in a handkerchief. She glanced about as if uncertain whom to approach, then headed straight for Mrs. Armitage. They spoke briefly in low tones until Mrs. Armitage nodded gravely and placed the item in her handbag. Miss Marple's eyes, unfocused to anyone watching, nonetheless took in the size, the fold of fabric, and the awkward way Lily's hands lingered after releasing it, as if she were unsure whether giving it up had been the right choice. Perhaps, sensing her look, Lily approached Miss Marple's table. "They keep asking about that day," she murmured. "I didn't remember before, but when I bent down by Mrs. Caxton, I picked up something from the grass. It wasn't the pendant. It was a little clasp, from a chain, I think. I didn't know it mattered." "Small things often matter very much, my dear," Miss Marple said, her tone warm but pointed. "And so often, they're missed because they seem unimportant." Lily blushed faintly and excused herself, leaving Miss Marple to her tea and her thoughts. A broken clasp might mean the pendant had not been placed carefully on Mrs. Caxton at all. It might have been torn away, then returned later. That idea, unsettling as it was, opened an entirely new set of possibilities. As evening gathered, Miss Marple sat in her parlor, adding her notes. A crushed white rose from the scene left hidden in the church, self-posted package before death, contents unknown. Sealed envelope to the vicar given to the inspector. Broken clasp found by Lily, possible pendant chain. The pendant was displayed publicly for first time, perhaps not voluntarily. She rested her pen, gazing out at the street where shadows lengthened under the lamplight. It was becoming clearer to her that the murder was not born of sudden passion, but of something planned, interwoven with old grievances, careful timing, and an object of persistent contention. Yet one question loomed larger than ever. Why now? Why had Mrs. Caxton stirred this long-sleeping matter into the open, and what private knowledge had compelled her to hint at fear without speaking it directly? Miss Marple knew that tomorrow she must learn more about the pendant's history. Its story would not be found in police records alone. It would be tucked into the collective memory of the village among those who had been present when the old grievances began. And she had just the right way to gather that history without drawing unwelcome attention. For Miss Marple understood a truth few detectives could boast. The dead may be silent, but the living always speak. Often more than they intended, and especially when they believed they were discussing something entirely different. She poured herself a final cup of tea, her mind already arranging the steps ahead. The path toward the answer was still winding, but she felt the faint, certain pull in its direction, like a thread slipping free from the tangle. Tomorrow she will begin to tug. The next morning began with a quiet drizzle fading into soft, silvery sunlight, a typical St. Ludlow's pattern that matched the mood of uncertainty still gripping the village. Miss Marple rose beforemost, having spent half the night distilling her thoughts into tidy notes and resolving that today would not pass without a deeper reckoning with the mystery of the pendant. There was no value, she felt, in pursuing only the surface details. The village had a way of clinging to gossip while missing the deeper truth, especially concerning objects like this peculiar necklace, which seemed to carry with it whispers of ancestry and old wounds. Miss Marple believed answers often hid in stories too faded for direct confession, but too potent for silence. After a breakfast of marmalade and toast, she set out for her first purposeful call. The cottage of Mrs. Fenley, a stooped but bright-eyed widow who had been lady's maid to 3 generations of the Caxton family. Mrs. Fenley's sitting room was lined with porcelain and faded velvet, housing the sort of memories that never quite leave their owners. She welcomed Miss Marple with wary courtesy, her gaze quick and shrewd beneath thick spectacles. "I thought you'd come," Mrs. Fenley said, voice low. "You were always clever enough to listen when no one else did." Miss Marple smiled in her gentle way, ensuring her manner was friendly rather than probing. "You were close to Mrs. Caxton and her husband, I remember. I hoped you might shed light on the pendant she wore. It seems to have caused quite a stir." Mrs. Fenley considered, fingers working the edge of her shawl. "That piece is old, older than Vivian, older than even Gregory's side of the family. Enamel on gold, one side blue and white, the other a tiny painted rose. I only ever saw it once before, decades ago, at the wedding of Mr. Caxton's mother. It vanished soon after, said to be lost when the Caxton estate was inventoried." "Did anyone ever suggest who took it? A servant? A relative?" Miss Marple asked. "There were whispers about Gregory," Mrs. Fenley admitted. "He came in from London after the funeral that year, claiming rights, but Vivian's mother-in-law kept quiet. Some said she feared a family curse. Silly talk, but families cling to their legends, don't they? I know Vivian didn't have it when Mr. Caxton passed. If she found it recently, it must have meant something special." Miss Marple listened closely, sifting sentiment from fact, and pressed gently. "Was there ever talk of money hidden with the pendant, or a secret known only to family?" Mrs. Fenley's lips pursed. "Once a rumor spread about a letter, a note tucked inside the clasp. But I doubt it. It's just a pretty thing, with too many stories for one small village. Gregory always wanted it. Mrs. Caxton's husband refused to let it go." Thanking Mrs. Fenley with genuine warmth, Miss Marple left with a faint impression. The pendant was more than ornamentation, yet its real secret was cloaked in confused perceptions, temptation, and familial rivalry. The notion of a lost letter, a curse, and Gregory's covetousness settled neatly in her mind. Intent on learning more, Miss Marple next visited the market square to seek out Gregory Ashby himself, newly returned to St. Ludlow's under the inspector's scrutiny. He was a tall, slightly nervous man, dressed in the manner of city folk, but careful to project an air of rural respectability. She found him engaged in a stiff conversation with Mr. Osborne, whose discomfort seemed to deepen with every passing moment. Miss Marple approached unobtrusively, greeting both men with her usual calm dignity. Gregory nodded sharply, evidently still stung by the swirl of accusations. "I've said it to the inspector," Gregory said, agitation showing through the veneer. "I have not seen Vivian since the funeral last year, and I had no quarrel with her. The pendant was supposed to come to me, yet it vanished, along with so much else after my uncle's death." Mr. Osborne coughed, avoiding Gregory's eye. Estates are rarely straightforward. Sentimental items cause the most trouble. Vivian claimed she found it among her late husband's things, but it could have surfaced from anywhere. Miss Marple's voice was almost dreamy. "Did Mrs. Caxton ever contact either of you about the pendant, or mention she feared for her safety?" Gregory hesitated. "Only once. She wrote to me about 4 weeks ago. I wanted advice about selling it back to the family if I was prepared to forgive old wounds. I replied through my solicitor, but she never answered." Mr. Osborne's brow furrowed. "She visited me 3 days before the party, asking about legal ownership, set on making things right by the family. I advised her to return it quietly and avoid any drama. But she seemed anxious and distracted." "Thank you both," Miss Marple said, her tone making them believe she'd dismissed the matter, though in truth she had gleaned more than they realized. A planned reconciliation, abrupt silence, an old letter never received. Nearby, Mrs. Penfold, an expert in expanding any innocent tale into juicy speculation, declared to passers-by that Gregory was out for blood and inheritance, drawing the kind of sidelong glances Miss Marple had learned to distrust. But she took another mental note. Gregory had motivation, but the timing was off. If the pendant had been found before, why only now display it, and why publicly hint at its fearful value? Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid her respects to the vicar again, asking after the envelope that Mrs. Caxton had left to be opened in the event of her death. Inspector Graves, coincidentally arriving, explained its content, a brief letter expressing concern about old enemies and family shadows, together with an instruction for the pendant to be returned to its rightful place in the Caxton family mausoleum, a gesture both reconciliatory and steeped in superstition. In the quiet of the vicar's study, Miss Marple mused, "People do fear objects sometimes, especially when they have seen them provoke trouble. But if reconciliation was Vivian's true intent, someone must have stopped her, and not only for money." "As for the pendant," Inspector Graves remarked, "the experts say it holds just a piece of paper hidden in the clasp. We'll see what it says." He seemed stymied by the superstitious air surrounding the case, a mixture of local folklore and actual resentment. Afterwards, Miss Marple found herself strolling past Mrs. Cummings's neat garden. The woman was tending her roses, her nerves more exposed than ever. Miss Marple stopped to chat warmly, asking about old family stories and, gently, if Mrs. Cummings knew more about Vivian's original intent in bringing the pendant out. "It was pride, I think," Mrs. Cummings replied, voice wavering. "Vivian knew the pendant was coveted, and perhaps was finally tired of secrets, but we never spoke openly. At the party, she showed it off in a way a little too deliberately, as if giving proof she was unafraid, challenging someone to settle old scores." Miss Marple offered sympathy, sensing there was a deeper bitterness in the words, but her goal was nearly complete. The picture was forming, with each piece now matching. A pendant steeped in old rivalry, last-minute attempts at peace, and a public gesture undoing years of caution. Evening fell on St. Ludlow's as Miss Marple returned home. In her parlour, she laid out all she had gathered: family jealousies, secret letters, a package presumably mailed by Mrs. Caxton to herself, a pendant concealing a forgotten note, and the dangerous act of exposing a long-held secret to the full glare of the community. Perhaps, she thought, the killer's motive was not greed alone, but fear of exposure, an old sin hidden, now at risk of being unearthed. She wrote quietly in her notebook, drawing up a list of possible scenarios and unresolved contradictions. Why did Mrs. Caxton choose the party, of all times, to wear the pendant? What message was concealed inside the clasp, and who knew of it beforehand? Had Gregory, Mr. Osborne, or Mrs. Cummings discovered Vivian's intent and feared what it would reveal? Who actually handled the pendant last? Was it torn from Vivian or returned after her death to mislead the investigation? The deeper truths, Miss Marple felt, lay not in the facts of the crime, but in the choices of the living those last few days. Everybody wanted closure, some for financial gain, others for relief from guilt, a few for the chance to keep their own secrets buried. Outside, the village buzzed with anticipation, a sense that answers might soon rise from beneath the polite surface. Miss Marple knew that the next step would bring confrontation, revelations, and perhaps another twist from those whose motives ran darkest. She poured her evening tea, her mind sharpening with every recalled word, gesture, and silence. Tomorrow would lift the veil further. She would see how far the web of old grievances had stretched and whose hand had committed the ultimate crime, under cover of legacy, envy, and the legacy of the enamelled pendant. Clouds hung thick above St. Ludlow's on the day everything changed, a shapeless, overcast sky, heavy with the promise of rain. It was the sort of weather that urges secrets into the light and sets the entire village searching for a shelter, both literal and metaphorical. Miss Marple, rising early from a night of restless curiosity, felt it in her bones. The story was close to the surface now, and it would not remain hidden much longer. The morning's peace, if such it could be called, was soon interrupted by brisk knocks at doors and hurried footsteps along narrow lanes. Inspector Graves, with his constables in tow, had resolved to bring each principal figure face to face, dispensing with gentle courtesy and demanding direct answers. The vicarage was chosen for the conversations, a neutral ground where even old enemies felt compelled to maintain rudimentary civility. Miss Marple, unobtrusive and quietly knitting in one corner, became a silent witness to the orchestrated confrontations, her eyes sharper than ever. She knew that what was said aloud mattered less than the quiet collisions bubbling beneath. The first to arrive was Gregory Ashby, summoned from his lodgings to account for his whereabouts on the day of the garden party and any prior correspondence with Mrs. Caxton. He appeared nervous and uncomfortable under scrutiny and denied any secret meetings. "I received her letter," Gregory insisted, voice tight. She wished to reconcile. If she could have settled the matter of the pendant, so much ill feeling might have ended. "I told her I wished for peace but never saw her in person. If you think I wanted her dead, you are very mistaken." Inspector Graves pressed, referencing the village's shared suspicions. Gregory's jaw worked as he struggled for composure. "The truth is, I knew she didn't trust me," he admitted. "Not since the inheritance dispute. I learned nothing of the pendant's return until after her death." Mrs. Cummings was next, her posture stiff with indignation. The inspector detailed the argument recounted by Lily, an exchange near the croquet lawn, sharp and perhaps too public. Mrs. Cummings met the challenge head-on. "We argued about the pendant, yes. Vivian taunted me, saying it would protect secrets kept far too long. I asked what she meant, but she refused to answer. After that, I left her alone. If you inquire about resentment, you'll find it everywhere in St. Ludlow's. Hers was not unique." Graves noted the phrasing. "You were seen handling a chain at the party. Lily saw you drop something. Can you explain?" Mrs. Cummings hesitated. "I found a clasp, broken by the croquet lawn. I thought it was my own from the string bag. I put it aside. Only later did I realize it matched Vivian's pendant chain. I returned it to Mrs. Armitage, thinking nothing of it." Miss Marple unobtrusively raised a question, her tone mild. "Did Mrs. Caxton mention a package or letter in your presence?" Mrs. Cummings blinked. "Number. But everyone has been saying she posted something to herself. It's all so tangled." I don't know what to believe." Mr. Osborne entered, shoulders hunched from days of tension. The inspector examined his involvement. "You advised Mrs. Caxton about the pendant and inheritance. Did she confide her fears about safety or mention being threatened?" Mr. Osborne's reply was cautious. "She seemed anxious, certain she wanted to prevent trouble. Her intention was to have the pendant returned to the family mausoleum as a gesture of peace. I warned her not to antagonize Gregory, but she wouldn't listen. I didn't know she'd make it so public." Miss Marple, always gentle but purposeful, remarked, "Legal advice can protect or provoke, depending on the listener's intent." "She didn't want to trust me," Osborne replied bleakly. "Everyone has their theories, but I had no interest in harming Vivian." Around the table, tension thickened as the vicar produced copies of letters left by Mrs. Caxton and handed over the sealed envelope, already opened by the authorities. The inspector read aloud. "Vivian Caxton's message. A plea for peace among the family, a wish for grudges to end, and a cryptic warning. If anything befalls me, let the truth rest with the pendant's secret discussion turned to the pendant's peculiar mechanism, a tiny compartment within the enamel, revealed to hold not a fortune nor a relic, but a simple note written decades ago." Mrs. Fenley, called to identify the handwriting, confirmed it belonged to Mrs. Caxton's late mother-in-law. The message, "Forgive what cannot be changed. Return this to its proper hands." But who knew before the fatal day that the pendant contained such a declaration? Who feared exposure most keenly? The questioning now circled Lily Dawes, who entered with a mixture of timidity and resolve. "I saw Mrs. Caxton earlier than most," Lily confessed. "She seemed upset. I watched her argue with Mrs. Cummings, then noticed her speaking softly to Mr. Osborne. When I found her, the pendant chain had snapped. I saw Mrs. Cummings near the roses just after." Inspector Graves grew stern. "Are you certain of the timeline?" Lily, pale but firm, nodded. "I watched everyone. Mrs. Cummings dropped the clasp near the croquet lawn, but the pendant was torn, not placed gently. I think someone argued with Vivian, and she clung too hard to the necklace." Miss Marple interjected. "People seldom break jewelry by accident. Sentiments run high. Sometimes panic snaps a chain no thief would touch." Gregory shifted in his seat, looking surreptitiously at Mrs. Cummings. Osborne, avoiding all eyes, stared at the note, as though hoping its bland forgiveness could end the nightmare. Then Inspector Graves introduced the next revelation. News of the posted package. The post mistress identified it as a small box addressed to Mrs. Caxton, left for collection but never retrieved. The contents. The original family will, unsigned and void, but evidence that Mrs. Caxton intended to settle every lingering dispute and claim. Those present listened in shocked silence. The arguments about inheritance could never hold, and the pendant's supposed value reduced to sentiment and family pride. A motive for distress, certainly, but not for murder. The air in the vicarage was heavy with both relief and rising unease. Motives were dissolving, and yet the crime remained. Someone in the room had pressed too hard or panicked under the weight of old fear and rivalry. Miss Marple excused herself, offering a soft assurance to the vicar before stepping outside. She watched the group behind the glass, faces lined with suspicion and regret, years of fractured trust coming suddenly to a head. The storm threatened but did not break. Each suspect remained under scrutiny, but the truth had not yet settled. As dusk crept over St. Ludlow's, Miss Marple took her habitual walk, reviewing her notes. The day had brought confrontation, a shift in perspective. Old secrets aired, the pendant's message revealed, and tempers exposed in full daylight. Yet the threads were not quite untangled. She felt in her heart that one final deception lay among the group, waiting to be uncovered. The village, restless and divided, seemed to sense the change. Conversations turned to questions about character, about who among them could be pushed to desperate action, and whether such desperation had been born that afternoon or years before. Miss Marple knew that the time had come for one last test, a psychological game that would force the guilty party to reveal what they had most carefully concealed. That evening, with the rain finally beginning to patter gently against her window, Miss Marple made preparations for the next day, arranging for a gathering at her own cottage, inviting each principal figure in turn. She planned to unlock the final mysteries not with evidence alone, but through subtle interplay, watching their reactions as she guided the conversation toward the heart of the matter. She sipped her tea quietly, listening to the distant tap of rain, and considered her next words. The moment of truth, she thought, must be reserved for the final act, but tonight she let herself linger on the web of motives and regrets, listening for the faintest tremor in the pattern of lies. St. Ludlow was ready for answers, though Miss Marple, with characteristic patience, knew that the heart of darkness in any village is never truly silent until someone risks speaking, and someone else is finally compelled to listen. The rain continued through the night and well into morning, rendering St. Ludlow unusually subdued. Normally, the village would have gathered around its hearths, content to let the outside world run its course. But today, a lingering tension pulsed beneath the drizzle, each neighbor glancing a little longer at the faces they passed, wondering which heart held the last fragment of a terrible truth. Miss Marple had spent her evening in quiet anticipation, knitting with more vigorous focus than usual, and writing a careful list of points in her notebook. The broken clasp, the unreadable emotions between Gregory and Mrs. Cummings, Osborne's withdrawn bearing, and the peculiar chain of events linking Pendant, letter, and legacy. She had already requested Gregory, Mrs. Cummings, Mr. Osborne and Lily Dawes come for tea at her cottage the next afternoon. Her house was set on the quieter lane at the village's edge, a warm and inviting space for reflection or discourse, a place where the ordinary seemed to reveal itself unsurprisingly. Yet today, Miss Marple intended that familiarity would serve as a stage for something less expected. The guests arrived one by one, shedding coats and umbrellas at the door. Miss Marple greeted each with a gentle smile and a customary plate of short bread. The room was snug, and the rain softened to a gentle patter outside, lending a sense of intimacy that made careful words seem easier to speak and harder to mask. Lily was first, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve, eyes darting to the others as they settled in. Gregory followed, his manner nervous but tightly controlled, an air of defensiveness clinging to each gesture. Mrs. Cummings swept in with measured dignity, a mask of composure set firmly despite the unease in her gaze. Mr. Osborne entered last, taking a seat near the window, claiming distraction in the view but listening keenly to every word. Miss Marple opened the gathering with casual talk, the state of the allotments, the village plans for the harvest supper, and the merits of weatherproof coats. It was Lily who finally spoke of the storm that had, ironically, come after the garden party. "It's as if the village is waiting for something," she murmured shyly, "like nobody can breathe properly until it's all finished." Miss Marple nodded, then set her cup down and spoke with purposeful clarity. "I've asked you all here today as friends and neighbors, though the times are strange indeed. We know that sometimes tragedy can pull loose threads and secrets slip from the fabric of a community. I cannot rid St. Ludlow's of heartache, but I hope we might ease its burden by seeking truth together." Their silence spoke volumes. Even Gregory seemed to shrink into his chair. Miss Marple's approach was never accusatory. She asked them each in turn to describe what they remembered of the last moments before Mrs. Caxton was found, what they saw, heard, and felt. She watched not for mistakes in recollection, but for signs, a break in a voice, an unconscious gesture, a silence held just a shade too long. Gregory recounted his disappointment at Vivian's refusal to clear the old Caxton account, his admission mixed with anxiety. "I thought she wanted to show the pendant as proof of her resolve," not provoke trouble. Mrs. Cummings, her knitting in her lap, said, "We were both tired, and old arguments surfaced too quickly. The pendant wasn't really my concern, it was family business. But she enjoyed the drama, I think. Mr. Osborne simply claimed, I tried to advise her. Mostly, I wanted peace. Things seldom finished well when pushed too far." Lily looked pale. "I didn't see what happened. After I found her, everyone started shouting. I just wanted to get away." Miss Marple refilled the cups and asked, almost as an aside, "May I show you all something?" From her knitting bag, she produced not the pendant itself, but its broken clasp, still attached to a frayed length of chain. She held it out, inviting inspection. "It struck me," she said, "how a small piece can be so intimate. This chain, for instance, broken, not by accident, but with determined force. Yet who would need such force for a pendant rarely worn and supposedly meant only for display?" She watched their reactions keenly. Gregory leaned forward, eyes narrowing with recognition, perhaps at identifying the chain as genuine. Mrs. Cummings's hand tightened around her knitting, an old impulse to guard herself. Osborne surveyed the clasp and hesitated, then looked away. But Lily blinked, lips parted as if about to speak, before she closed them in uncertainty. Miss Marple continued, voice soft but resonant. "Vivian's intent that day was peace, not provocation. Her letter confirms as much. The pendant's secret, too, was simple. Forgiveness." She turned to Mr. Osborne. "You advised her. Did you know the family will be found?" Osborne shook his head. She said nothing. "I only heard the day after her passing. I asked because only one who understood the real risks of exposure, of loss, not gain, would have tried to stop her from showing this publicly," Miss Marple advanced. "Not Gregory, who had most to gain by peace, not Mrs. Cummings, whose quarrel was personal, not strategic, not Lily, who, though frightened, confided the truth at every turn." She let the silence build, then continued gently, "But there is a kind of anxiety one only sees when people fear more than accusation, when they fear losing their security. Mr. Osborne, you were executor for Vivian's husband's estate. Was it possible that in the rush of paperwork, the pendant made its way to you?" Osborne stiffened, turning away from the window. "If you are suggesting—" "I am suggesting nothing," Miss Marple replied, "except that when Vivian came to you for guidance, she was not asking about inheritance, but what she ought to do with a secret. You advised her not to display the pendant, but she did, and the result—" She hesitated, laying the chain carefully upon the table. "The pendant was torn from Vivian that afternoon, not voluntarily. Someone argued bitterly, not about legacy, but about what exposure of the truth would mean. One person feared the letter would reveal a mistake in the estate, a misfiled claim, perhaps, or proof of forgery. That person, desperate, snapped the chain. In panic, they replaced the pendant, hiding the moment of violence with a semblance of peace." The room was utterly still. Osborne's hand shook. Gregory looked stunned. Mrs. Cummings sat rigid. Only Lily seemed more relieved than frightened, as if the spell had at last been broken. Miss Marple finished gently. "People rarely kill for family heirlooms alone. They kill from panic, when the rituals of protection unravel and the truth is about to emerge. Mr. Osborne, did you mean only to stop Vivian from showing the pendant? Or did you realize, too late, that stopping her would mean forever hiding your own error?" The words settled. Osborne stared down, voice thin and brittle. "She threatened to expose an old mistake. I never meant—" She grabbed the chain. "I wasn't thinking." Miss Marple reached over, placing her hand on his. "You did not mean to kill her, but you could not bear the thought of losing your reputation to a secret long suppressed." She turned to the others. "That is the tragedy. Pride wrapped in error, the legacy not of the pendant, but of the very human urge to conceal mistakes at all costs." the gathering broke slowly. Inspector Graves arrived, called by Miss Marple's quiet message, and took Osborne into custody with dignity. Gregory wept openly, relieved the old feud could finally end. Mrs. Cummings, finally free from suspicion, embraced Lily, who had somehow become the unwitting keeper of the story's truest detail. Miss Marple, left alone in her parlour as the rain eased outside, wrote her last notes in a tidy hand. St. Ludlow's would perhaps never be quite so innocent again. Legacies, like secrets, have a way of outlasting the generations that bear them. But peace, Miss Marple believed, is the most valuable inheritance of all, earned only by those willing to face the truth, however untidy its arrival. In St. Ludlow's, the days after the truth came to light were marked by a peculiar hush. Not the fearful silence that follows tragedy, nor even the charged pauses that had filled the proceeding. Weeks of suspicion, but a gentler, more reflective quiet. A time when neighbors gathered with cautious greetings, aware at last that their world had shifted. The rain that had for so long accompanied the village's anxieties abated, leaving behind crisp sunlight like new linen hung after a storm, everything brighter, even if the marks of trouble had not wholly faded. Miss Marple's cottage became a focal point, if only in memory. Residents spoke of her wisdom in low voices, not quite ready to admit her insight had been vital while their own theories washed fruitlessly into rumor. For a time, the ordinary rhythms returned. Mrs. Wickham swept her shop front, the vicar polished his sermon for the coming Sunday, and Lily Dawes, though still pale, took up her place at the grocer's, gradually shedding the notoriety brought by her discovery. Yet beneath this renewal, the consequences of the case ran deep. Mr. Osborne, whose fate was sealed by the quiet confession on that stormy afternoon, remained in the custody of Inspector Graves. His absence was deeply felt, not least by those who had depended on his quiet legal stewardship. The arrangements for the summer fete stalled, documents delayed, and a scrambling of plans that revealed just how entwined his life had been with the daily order. None spoke of him with bitterness. The story Miss Marple had helped uncover replaced anger with sad understanding. He had not meant murder, but desperation, pride, and the convergence of long-hidden mistakes and sudden fear had led him irretrievably into darkness. Miss Marple herself saw little need to linger over the victory of her deductions. She accepted visitors with her usual modest smile, serving tea and shortbread while the villagers, uncertain at first, grew bold enough to ask how, precisely, she had seen through the web of deception. On one brisk afternoon, Mrs. Armitage and Mrs. Penfold sat with her in the sunny parlour, listening as Miss Marple recounted the threads she had gathered. Her manner was gentle, never boastful, her voice as soft as if she were discussing knitting patterns rather than unraveling a murder. It wasn't only what people said, Miss Marple explained, pouring tea into delicate blue cups. It was what they didn't do. Vivian Caxton wanted peace, not drama. She chose the garden party to show her pendant because she believed the village was ready for forgiveness. When she displayed it, she revealed more than she knew. Old family wounds, yes, but also the proof, or so she thought, that all debts could be erased by a gesture of goodwill. Mrs. Penfold leaned forward, unable to resist the lure of detail. "But how did you know Mr. Osborne was the one?" Miss Marple smiled. Sometimes, Mrs. Penfold, a guilty person's fear is less about crime than about loss of reputation. Osborne's advice to Vivian was never businesslike. It was layered in anxiety. He stalled, redirected, and, when pressed, avoided all mention of the posted will. Only someone who feared exposure of a hidden error, a misfiled claim perhaps, would be so tense when peace seemed near. Mrs. Armitage, thoughtful, asked, "And the clasp, Jane?" That was the key. Miss Marple set her cup down. A broken chain is rarely accidental when tensions run high. Vivian did not simply drop her pendant. It was snatched in the course of an argument. Osborne, fearing the contents of the pendant and the will, panicked and tried to take it from her. In the confusion, the pendant was torn, and to avoid suspicion, he replaced it, hoping the evidence of violence would remain hidden beneath apparent routine. Mrs. Penfold let out a long breath, her eyes wide. And the letter in the pendant. Such a simple thing, after all. Precisely, Miss Marple said. Forgiveness, but also a warning that the heart of the problem lay deeper than mere family squabbles. People hold on to pride, Mrs. Penfold, and secrets can become burdens heavier than gold. Across the village, similar conversations played out. Inspector Graves gave a careful account at the church hall, explaining that evidence and testimony had led to Osborne, not by malice, but by circumstance. An administrator's error, compounded by panic and a tragic confrontation. The pendant's role was clarified, its history laid out so that gossip would settle. Gregory Ashby, for his part, found new sympathy among the villagers. The old feud with Vivian's family ended at last, if not on the terms he might have wished. Mrs. Cummings resumed her place among the church volunteers, unburdened by suspicion, though chastened by the ordeal. As for Lily Dawes, she visited Miss Marple one last time, buoyed by a sense of resolution but aware that the memory would linger. "Will things ever be the same?" Lily asked quietly. Miss Marple smiled, her manner full of patient reassurance. "They never are, dear, after such things. But people heal, as villages do. Scars remain, but so do lessons, and kindness, if we're fortunate." Miss Marple's own reflections in the days that followed turned, as ever, not to triumph, but to the nature of human frailty. She wrote in her notebook, now nearly filled with tidy script. People fear exposure. Pride makes for desperate acts. Legacies are less about objects and more about wounds left unhealed. Forgiveness costs little, but the inability to offer it can be fatal. In every village, truth is found not in what everyone sees, but in what a few remember, and many choose to forget. The sun rose higher each morning, washing St. Ludlow's in new optimism. The annual fete was rescheduled, the church roof fund redoubled, the market stalls rebuilt. Mrs. Armitage's roses bloomed as splendidly as ever, and the garden party would, in years to come, be recalled not for tragedy, but as the moment when hidden burdens finally lost their power. Miss Marple, serene as ever, continued her gentle rounds, listening, observing, and knitting. Her genius remained the quiet kind, concealed behind amiable words, revealed only to those who truly needed it. Such was the legacy she preferred, a wisdom shared with all and a quiet certainty that, beneath the surface, justice had been served, not by accusation or force, but by the patient unraveling of truth. In the heart of St. Ludlow's, villagers carried on with new purpose. Suspicion faded, relationships healed, and the lesson of the enamelled pendant, its legacy of pride, forgiveness, and human folly, became, in time, simply another thread in the rich tapestry of village life. And Miss Marple, with a sigh of gentle satisfaction, looked out from her parlor window, ever watchful, ever ready for the next small mystery that might knock quietly at her door. The late summer sunlight returned to St. Ludlow's, painting the village in honeyed gold as its gardens thrived, and laughter, once tentative, began to resonate once more through open windows. In every corner, gentle efforts to restore the ordinary, replacing broken flower pots, mending the croquet lawn, reopening shuttered shop doors, spoke to the unspoken need for renewal. Life, as Miss Marple so often observed, had a way of reasserting itself after the disturbance of tragedy, but never quite in the same shape as before. Miss Marple herself felt the stirrings of bittersweet contentment as she wandered the familiar paths, greeting neighbors restored to their old selves but subtly altered by what had passed. The story of Mrs. Caxton's death and the enamelled pendant faded from daily talk. replaced by newer matters. The vicar's garden had won a county prize, and Mrs. Penfold suspected a fox had found its way into her shed. Yet underneath, the memory persisted, twinges of guilt, relief, and new wisdom weaving through the fabric of daily routine. A week after the final revelations, Miss Marple found herself in her parlour with a fresh pot of tea and her ever-present notebook. She looked out onto the green, watching children play croquet under the supervision of Mrs. Armitage, whose patience and sternness had taken on an almost legendary quality. Mrs. Wickham passed by with the post, waving cheerfully. Even young Lily Dawes, braver now, ran errands along the lane, her customary nerves eased by a village that had come together to protect her rather than ostracize her. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the echoes of the case. She reflected on Osborne's fall, how a single moment of panic, fed by years of hidden error and the fear of disgrace, could unravel a life otherwise marked by kindness and diligence. She considered Mrs. Cummings, who now moved through the village with a little less sharpness, her smiles softer and more genuine. Gregory Ashby, too, found himself welcomed at last, his old feud with the Caxton family no longer an open wound. Peace, however hard won, was slowly settling in. As for herself, Miss Marple felt no pride in the solution, only a quiet satisfaction born from having understood and foregone the urge to judge too hastily. She recalled the lessons she had learned from St. Ludlow's, that forgiveness, even when difficult, could be more restorative than justice. That suspicion was often born not from evidence but from old fears and rivalries, and that every small village stage could host very large dramas, visible only to those willing to sit quietly and see beyond appearances. She penned a few final notes. Truth, once revealed, runs through a community like sunlight, cleansing, lingering, always faintly warming even the shadowed corners. People are rarely simple in what drives them. Old wounds shape new mistakes. The careful watcher finds patterns where others see only mess, but must always choose humility in the aftermath. There is no greater legacy than kindness. No pendant, letter, or heirloom compares. Late in the day, Miss Marple ventured to the churchyard, where Inspector Graves met her at the gate. They walked together among the old gravestones, talking gently about forgiveness and consequence. "Things seem calm again," Graves remarked, with an air of quiet gratitude. "You saw what nobody else did." "Oh, not nobody," Miss Marple replied with her characteristic modesty. "Most could see, if only they trusted what people show in the soft moments, not just the frantic ones, and you listened, which makes all the difference." Graves nodded, troubled but resolute. "You never rest, do you, Jane? Rest is for those without curiosity. Life is full of patterns, Inspector. Some human, some divine. Each must be read with care." Before parting, the inspector thanked her not just for the solution, but for restoring the community's sense of itself. "You make it easier for us to carry on, even after." Miss Marple smiled, watching him stride away with newfound assurance. In the weeks that followed, restoration swept through St. Ludlow's with gentle purpose. The church roof fund flourished. Mrs. Armitage hosted another, quieter tea party, attended by all the villagers. The talk was cheerful, the old jokes revived, but a new sense of togetherness lingered beneath every exchange. Even Mrs. Penfold's fox was discovered to be nothing more than a stray tabby, which the children soon adopted and named for Mrs. Caxton. Lily, still sometimes uneasy, grew in confidence under Miss Marple's mentorship, learning to trust her own observations and to speak up when others faltered. Gregory became the new steward of the Caxton family's local interests, overseeing a modest scholarship for village children as a gesture of reconciliation. Miss Marple's role returned to that of a gentle observer, her knitting bag ever present, her advice sought in matters large and small. Late one evening, as the sun slipped behind the copper beech outside her window, Miss Marple sat in quiet contemplation. She thought of all the stories yet to be told, and St. Ludlow's, knowing that with time other mysteries would arise. Less dramatic, perhaps, but no less vital to the people whose lives twined together in small but significant ways. Her last note in the case read simply, "The legacy of the enamelled pendant is not in the tragedy it bore, but in the healing it permitted when truth, forgiveness, and courage met at last." She closed her notebook, setting it gently on her desk, and gazed out into the evening. Crickets sang in the grass. A cat wandered along the fence, and the air tasted of new beginnings. In her heart, as always, Miss Marple trusted that even the deepest of secrets, brought to sunlight not by force, but by patient kindness, could leave behind not only peace, but a certain quiet joy. St. Ludlow slept soundly that night, the village having learned and healed under the watchful eye of its quietest, sharpest mind, stood ready for whatever gentle mystery tomorrow might bring. And in her corner, with a fresh skein of wool and a familiar twinkle in her eye, Miss Marple was waiting. The evenings in St. Ludlow's grew shorter and softer as summer slipped gradually toward autumn, a steadier shift than the village's recent tumult, but not without its own sense of closure and new beginning. The copper beech at Miss Marple's window cushioned the light, and scents of ripe apples and cut hay drifted through the hedgerows. In this peaceful lap of the season, the change left by the events surrounding Mrs. Caxton's death was felt less as a rupture and more as an awakening, a subtle remaking of old relationships built now on clearer understanding. Miss Marple stood at her fireside, gazing into the gentle glow that illuminated her parlor. The room itself bore the marks of a life lived quietly but richly. The neat knitting basket, the shelf overflowing with battered mysteries and village chronicles, and the clock ticking unobtrusively above lace curtains. Tonight she was not alone, for the old, trusted companions of her solitude, thoughtful silence and good company, were joined by a handful of guests brought together out of gratitude and a desire for wisdom. Mrs. Armitage had invited herself, as she was sometimes apt to do in times of reflection. Lily Dawes sat nearby, hands folded primly, emboldened by the changes in her own fortunes and the supportive encouragement that now shaped her days. Gregory Ashby, less stern than before, found himself entranced by Lily's recounting of the splendors of school and the pleasures of an open future. Mrs. Penfold was there too, her curiosity undimmed, determined to probe the secrets of how Miss Marple understood the hearts of those around her. Their conversation meandered, never forced, weaving around the story of the pendant as one might circle a lake, approaching from different angles, pausing now and then to share a personal tale, drifting away and returning again. What they wanted was not clarification, but comfort, the reassurance that things made sense in the end and that the village could now rest easy. As the fire danced warmly, Mrs. Armitage spoke first. "Jane, I've tried to tell myself that the old fears and the new hurts are past, but sometimes the memory of all that disruption returns at unexpected moments like crossing the green in early dusk. Do you suppose we shall ever forget entirely?" Miss Marple's smile, affectionate and wise, glimmered in the flicker of firelight. "Don't forget, my dear. We learn and remember, but the sharp edge fades. The village becomes stronger with each lesson, and so do its people. Pain is a part of memory, but so is growth." Gregory added, "When I first returned to St. Ludlow's, I felt like a stranger, someone who belonged more to old grievances than fresh starts. Finding my place again seems like a gift, but I wonder if part of me will always keep one foot in the past." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "That is only natural. The past shapes us, Gregory. But consider this. The legacy you bear now is not the pendant, nor the quarrel over inheritances. It is your willingness to let go, offering something to others, even when forgiveness seems impossible. Peace is a practice, not a destination." Mrs. Penfold, never quite able to restrain herself, leaned in. You always know what people are feeling, Jane. How do you do it? Is it intuition, or habit, or simply paying close attention? Miss Marple reflected for a moment. Attention, yes, and humility. Years among neighbors, every mood and manner noted. I never presume. I listen, and sometimes, when others would rather rush or judge, I wait. People tell you what matters most when they believe they're only discussing small things. That is the key of a village, and, I suspect, of life. The conversation paused as Lily added wood to the fire, her own voice steadier now. After all this, I sometimes wonder if secrets are best left alone. If I had not found Mrs. Caxton, perhaps nothing would have changed. Was it right to bring everything out into the open? Miss Marple regarded her kindly. Secrets, my dear, are like thorns in a cushion. Hidden, they cause pain unknowingly. Revealed, they may trouble us, but at least the hurting has a reason and an end. You did as any honest heart would. Later, as tea was served and the autumn air pressed gently against the windows, the evening drifted into shared reflection. Stories of other times in St. Ludlow's, misunderstandings resolved, small kindnesses magnified in the retelling, wove together into a tapestry of relief and hope. Everyone agreed the village was stronger because it had faced itself honestly, not because it remained unchanged. Gregory described his new project, a small lending library attached to the old Caxton estate, dedicated to Mrs. Caxton's memory and to encouraging the young and uncertain. Mrs. Armitage promised a new series of community gatherings, less formal, more open to the joys and sorrows of daily living. Lily was asked to help organize, her confidence now trusted by all. Even Mrs. Penfold, having learned more from Miss Marple than she'd ever gleaned from gossip, spoke of turning her formidable energies to charity. Miss Marple listened, ever the gentle guide, offering advice when asked and letting others speak when silence seemed more fitting. She understood now, better than most, that the process of healing was itself a mystery, a gradual unfolding that required patience and faith. The village had come through the storm, not unscathed, but wiser and more united. As the evening drew to a close, Lily asked what Miss Marple most hoped for the future of St. Mary Mead. Ludlow's. She answered softly. Kindness and curiosity. The willingness to forgive old errors and to ask new questions. Every answer matters less than the kindness with which it is sought. The guests departed one by one, the firelight trailing them onto the quiet lane. At her window, Miss Marple watched until the last lamp blinked out, reveling in the stillness. The moon rose, gentle and full, catching the contours of hedges and doorways, a village at peace, and a world ready for tomorrow's modest mysteries, whether joyful or sorrowful. She added a last line to her notebook, the final entry for the case of the enamelled pendant. In the fireside glow of a forgiven village, every heart knows more, and every burden weighs less. Miss Marple settled in her chair, needles poised and mind serene, always knowing to expect small miracles in the ordinary days to come. For in villages like St. Ludlow's, the true mystery was not what secrets might emerge, but how gently, given time, they could be healed. And in the quiet, enduring presence of humanity, Miss Marple herself found her greatest comfort, the wisdom born by firelight, shared in peace. Dawn pressed softly into St. Ludlow's, painting long gold lines across cottage roofs and church spires, bringing with it a sense of full renewal at last. The mists that had clung to the lanes lifted in gentle spirals, revealing a village freshly washed, its residents eager, if still a little tender, to face the world as it was, with its secrets aired and its wounds beginning to mend. Miss Marple had always admired the way mornings were greeted in St. Ludlow's, not with haste or noisy bustle, but with a ritual of cheerful tasks and neighborly greetings. This morning she set out not in pursuit of any mystery, but in celebration. She walked slowly, noticing the clean sweep of doorsteps, the laughter of children preparing for school, and the way Mrs. Wickham and Mrs. Penfold chatted amiably over their garden gates. Their words flowed, not with rumor, but with gentle optimism for the day ahead, a marked difference from the urgency and suspicion that had once shadowed their conversations. At the green, abundant now with September's color, the annual village market bustled. Stalls brimmed with apples and late, dahlias, pots of honey, and rolls of new wool, symbols of continuity in the face of everything that had changed. Miss Marple paused to examine the wares, exchanging pleasantries and dispensing advice on marmalade recipes and pest-free gardening. The villagers had come to treasure these moments, their conversation threaded with gratitude for having passed so recently through darkness into sunlight. Mr. Ashby, the once estranged cousin, managed the market accounts with newfound assurance. He shared a joke with Mrs. Cummings, who, less guarded than ever before, handed out samples of her homemade lemon cake. Their exchange, casual, genuine, and lacking in old grudges, was observed quietly by Inspector Graves, whose presence now reassured rather than unsettled. The community had learned that not all interventions were harsh, and forgiveness could blossom if given room and light. Nearby, Lily Dawes moved with certainty among her friends. She no longer shrank from conversation, nor blushed at remarks, but laughed aloud and spoke brightly of her plans for autumn. Teachers remarked on her diligence, elders nodded in approval, and her mother, a figure once defined by worry, now smiled freely. The story of the pendant became, for Lily, not a source of shame, but a badge of courage, a mark that sometimes being the unlikely witness requires not just alertness and honesty, but a kind of bravery inaccessible to those who'd never faced fear. As Miss Marple continued her leisurely round, she encountered Gregory at the door to what was now, officially, the Caxton Lending Library. The small room was already bustling, children examining picture books, mothers leafing through gardening guides, and elderly residents debating the finer points of Agatha Christie and Charles Dickens. Gregory greeted Miss Marple warmly, eager to share his satisfaction in seeing the family estate transformed from fuel for discord into a wellspring of community benefit. "I think Vivian would have approved," Gregory remarked, motioning to a shelf bearing her name. Miss Marple responded with a gentle smile. Mrs. Caxton was not always easy, but she wished for peace. What matters in the end is not how we quarrel, but how we make amends. Gregory nodded, his gaze lingering on a group of children engrossed in a picture book. "You've given us a new start, Jane, not by solving a crime, but by making us see one another with kinder eyes." The morning hours slipped away, and St. Ludlow's settled into the rhythm of restored confidence. At the tea-room, Mrs. Penfold and Mrs. Armitage led a gathering devoted to planning a harvest festival, one that, for the first time, would include every resident, regardless of role in recent troubles. The spirit of forgiveness, prompted not least by Miss Marple's example, permeated the room, animating earnest volunteers and swaying even the more taciturn villagers into joining preparations. Over her cup of Earl Grey, Miss Marple offered gentle advice on seating arrangements and the best order for speeches. She listened to stories, sometimes interjected a subtle question, and tracked the careful weaving of new connections. The community, she observed, was behaving almost like a careful knitter, picking up dropped stitches, mending worn edges, and adjusting the pattern to allow for changes and surprises. Later that day, with sunlight glinting on washed windows, Miss Marple found herself in the churchyard once more, where she met Inspector Graves beneath the yew trees. Their conversation drifted from village affairs to larger matters. "You know," Graves admitted, "I'm still learning how important it is to let people speak their truths before rushing to judgment. Your method, Jane, saved us all much grief." Miss Marple regarded him kindly, reflecting on what she knew to be the greatest gift in any small community, the willingness to listen deeply even when the story is tangled with fear or pride. "All any detective knows," she answered, "is that the facts matter little without the people to shape them. It's their hearts, not their histories, that reveal the true legacy of a crime and of the heroes it calls forth." Inspector Graves smiled in agreement, and together they watched the village settle into the renewed peace of evening. As dusk approached, Miss Marple returned home, her notebook nearly complete, but her mind still a-whirl with impressions, lessons, and the gentle satisfaction of seeing a village knit together anew. The parlor glowed with the last soft light. She sat by the open window, the copper beech rustling quietly, her hands folded in her lap. In those tranquil moments, she pondered the future of St. Ludlow's. She imagined more garden parties, less grand perhaps, but full of sincere conversation and laughter. She saw children growing, old rivalries fading, and new kindnesses blossoming even as the seasons turned. She thought of those who still held small secrets and resolved to remain, as always, the quiet ear and wise counsel for any villager needing reassurance. Miss Marple took up her pen one last time for the case and wrote, "The healing of St. Ludlow's came not from revelation alone, but from forgiveness, patience, and the courage to trust beneath suspicion." Her days would continue as before. Gentle walks, thoughtful observation, and encouragement for those struggling with dilemmas large and small. She knew, too, that each story, even one resolved in pain, could seed not only new mysteries but also new hope. And with that thought, she gazed out at her village as twilight deepened, content in the knowledge that beneath the quiet surface, the lessons of the enamelled pendant would live on. A reminder that legacy is not what we inherit, but what we choose to build together. In St. Ludlow's, as in all places where humanity weaves its days, the greatest mysteries would always turn on love found, lost, and rediscovered. Miss Marple closed her notebook and reached for her knitting. The gentle, lasting work of care and of watchfulness never truly ends.